Welcome to this conference on war in cities, addressing the humanitarian challenges. Before giving the floor to Helen Durham, the Director of Law and Policy at the ICRC, who will moderate this discussion and introduce our panelists, let me say a few words about the new cycle of conferences we are launching this evening on war in cities. We are starting a series of conferences and debates in Geneva and in many locations around the world on this issue. Our next issue of the International Review of the Red Cross will also cover the topic of war in cities. And we are planning to organize conferences in different locations. At our conference center in Geneva, the Humanitarian, we have also a new conference center in Moscow. And we hope that many of you, many ICRC colleagues, many colleagues from the Red Cross and Red Crescent movements, but also academics and governments will join us in highlighting this issue and exploring this issue of war in cities. So why do we have a conference cycle on this topic? Why having such a cycle? First, because it's an urgent humanitarian issue. It's a growing need, and it is of global importance. With 2/3 of the global population predicted to be living in cities by 2030, urban centers worldwide are struggling to absorb this growth. And this goes in parallel with armed conflicts taking place in urban environments. In Iraq, in Yemen, or in Syria today, cities are battlefields. So it's not only the basic rules of conduct of hostilities in urban areas which appear to be challenged. But we see that all actors struggle to cope with these challenges which are linked to the urbanization of warfare or violence. And their responses is often insufficient or inadequate. So what are the specific challenges faced in urban warfare? Is international humanitarian law adequate? These are questions we are going to explore this evening, but it's only the start of the discussion. And the second reason for this cycle is that we need to address this issue in a holistic way. We live in a time of paradox, where the world is both connected yet divided. We are very well informed, but very often it creates confusion and not an objective perception of reality. However, at the same time, we have never been so well equipped in terms of legal instruments, in terms of research, in terms of capacities. And we've seen tremendous progress. We have a growing consciousness of our common humanity and our interdependencies. So we want to use these capacities and to connect conversations among experts from different fields, not only the legal, but also engineers, medical experts, governments, the military, to find common solutions and to connect places where violence happens with places where reflection, decisions, and the future can be shaped to find solutions. So let's start this discussion this evening. Let's continue. I hope there will be many interesting questions. We have a great panel, and I will let now Helen introduce it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent. A warm good evening to you all. It is indeed a week of IHL, almost an IHL festival, how much rich discussions we're having. So I'm delighted to be chairing this panel. As Vincent expressed, the urbanisation of conflict is of critical interest and importance to a humanitarian organisation like the ICRC. We are seeing many trends at the moment. We are seeing conflict being more protracted. 36 years is the average time in our top 10 delegations where we stay, and that is a telling statistic. We are seeing conflict being more fragmented, where parties to a conflict are often more numerous and fragment within themselves. And in fact, if you look at the work we need to do to get access, safe access in a place like Syria, At times, our colleagues have to negotiate with up to 30 groups. So we're seeing fragmentation, but tonight and the conference series that goes forward is about urbanisation. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you 3 experts that will guide us through some of the basic questions. As the first event in this conference series, we really want to map out the issues for you. So we chose 3 experts with distinct views on the issue of war in cities. What I will do is I will introduce all the speakers at once, or then hear from them sequentially. I will ask a few questions of each other, because I think it's often good to hear the experts, if not cross-examine each other, at least ask each other for more ideas of what they presented. And then, of course, we will throw the floor over to you, the good audience, full of IHL and other experts. So that will be how the event goes. And I commit to finishing on time at 7 o'clock. It's been a long day for many of us, and there are even more things to do this evening. But our first speaker here on my right here is Valerie Petitpierre. She is the Operations Coordinator for the Near and Middle East for the International Committee of Red Cross, a good colleague of mine. She's based at the ICRC headquarters here in Geneva, and she gives managerial, programming and diplomatic support to the delegation in Syria and oversees the coordination of activities in this context, so has some daily experience on the issues. We were lucky to have Valerie join the ICRC in 2004, and Valerie is going to set the scene, giving us some more details on why this topic matters and touching on the humanitarian consequences that we see from the rapidly urbanisation of conflict. We'll then hear from Robin Geis, who is a Professor of International Law and Security at the University of Glasgow. Welcome, Robin. You've come some far to be here with us tonight. Now, he joined the University of Glasgow's Law School in 2013. Previously, he was a Professor of International and European Law at the University of Potsdam. And prior to that, I'm very proud to say he worked as a legal advisor to the ICRC in Geneva, so comes from good stock. We then will hear from Erik Jensen, and Erik is a professor of law at Brigham Young University, where he teaches and writes on the areas of public international law, criminal law, the law of armed conflict, international criminal law, and national security law. And prior to joining BYW in 2011, he spent 2 years teaching at the Fordham Law School in New York City, and then 20 years in the United States Army, including as a judge advocate. Robin will explain to us some of the issues relating to war in cities and asymmetrical conflict, and tackle some of the main challenges there. And we'll hear from Erik about the military perspective, in particular key security issues. So that's a good breadth of those who have a expertise and knowledge on this topic. But I would like to hand the floor over to Valerie, and I welcome you to present for us, Valerie.
Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm very pleased to be here tonight. It's an opportunity for me to talk to you, to address you today, especially since we are living at a time when wars are more and more taking place in cities. Indeed, most recent estimates that around 50 million people today live in live in cities affected by wars. Sadly, the images of destroyed hospitals, flattened houses, shelled out buildings are all too familiar to all of us. But consequences of wars go far beyond the visible signs of destruction that we usually see. As we speak, in cities like Aleppo, Mosul, Taiz, Bangui, Maiduguri, Donetsk, millions of people are struggling to survive. Men, women, children are living in fear and uncertainty. In this presentation tonight, I would like to address three main issues. Why do wars in cities matter? What are the challenges for humanitarian actors? What does need to happen? So why do wars in cities matter? First of all, because of their impact, which is so extensive. It's not only because of the number of people who live in cities, it's also because of the complex nature of urban settings. In cities, essential services such as energy and water supplies, healthcare, waste management are all interconnected. For example, a single bomb blast can damage one pipe, which can then cut off water supplies to hundreds of thousands of people for weeks. Also, one bomb blast can destroy an electrical facility, shutting down the water to an entire neighborhood or a hospital. Furthermore, essential services are made of interdependent components. First, the people, such as engineers, doctors, then hardware or equipment, and then consumables, such as fuel or medicine. And these components, they are not sufficient on their own. For example, if you have an X-ray machine in a hospital and the doctor able to use this machine was killed or fled the country, it's pointless to have such a machine. Armed conflicts also can affect all these components, any or all of these components, either directly, for instance, when a water tank is damaged by a shell, or indirectly when a hospital is bombed and stops providing emergency care. Direct and indirect effects can in turn have a cumulative impact, which is the case in many protracted conflicts that we are witnessing today. When the impact is cumulative, it can become too technically difficult or simply too expensive to reverse the situation. Wars in cities also do matter in terms of humanitarian consequences, in the short and in the long term. As we all know, urban settings are densely populated areas. When cities are affected by fighting, it can lead to massive loss of life, injuries, disabilities, and displacement of population. People in cities are more dependent also on essential services than people in rural areas. When electricity and water supplies are affected, when hospitals are destroyed, life becomes much harder for those who survive. Disruptions to essential services can affect the health, the livelihoods, the food security, the dignity of the residents. They can also cause very high level of stress and anxiety among the population, which is a consequence that is very often not visible. Obviously, all these consequences, these humanitarian needs that I just mentioned, they become even more acute when conflicts extend for years or even decades. Men, women, children who survive wars in cities have no choice but to adapt to extraordinary circumstances. They also need emergency assistance and protection. So what are the challenges for humanitarian actors like the ICRC? The first challenge, I would say, is related to the scale of the needs on the one hand, and also to the complexity of the required response. In cities affected by armed conflicts, insecurity and lack of access, as Hélène mentioned in the introduction, very often also prevent humanitarian actors from carrying out their tasks. Another challenge derives from the fact that for a long time the traditional humanitarian response was focused on rural areas and camps for internally displaced persons. If wars in cities are not new, humanitarian actors are new to cities. The classic humanitarian action often means addressing immediate needs and reacting to the direct impact of violence. For instance, food parcels can be distributed to displaced people, water trucking can be organized, Shelter, blankets are delivered to families whose belongings and houses have been destroyed. But is this type of assistance really adequate in cities affected by wars? The answer is no. Fixing a water network is much more effective than distributing bottles of water, for instance. The result is that an entire neighborhood, entire communities will be able to get water if the water network is fixed, and not only single households. Of course, all humanitarian actors may not have the technical, the financial, the logistical capacity to carry out heavy works to rehabilitate damaged health centers or water networks. This is where also partnering with local authorities or with service providers becomes a necessity. Conflicts in urban settings, especially if they last years or decades, require interventions that take into account the longer-term realities and the needs of the affected populations. So what needs to happen? First, wars in cities, especially if they are protracted, require efforts to link relief activities in the short term and development activities in the long term. Humanitarian and development actors must work in a coordinated and complementary way, and donors should reconsider their funding mechanism to ensure that it matches with the scale and the duration of the challenges. Second, the international humanitarian law must be respected. My colleagues will talk a lot about that, but just a few words from my side. Under this law, international humanitarian law, each of the components of any essential services that I mentioned before, people, hardware, consumables, each of these components is covered by the protection afforded to civilian and civilian objects. Parties to conflict must spare civilians and essential critical facilities. They should also better respect the rules of proportionality and precaution in attacks. As cities are more and more becoming the battlefields of our time, armed forces have to adapt their means and methods of warfare to urban environments. The use of explosive weapons with a wide impact area, such as missiles, mortars, rockets, should be avoided in heavily populated areas. Last point, what is needed when wars are raging in urban centers? There must be somebody willing to take the risks and deliver to the people trapped in the fighting. This can be humanitarian actors or anyone else. Organizations and services must be allowed to reach people safely, without restrictions and without conditions. And parties to the conflict should not see this action as a threat, but rather as a gesture of humanity.
Thank you, Valerie. I'll now pass it over to Robin.
Good evening, everyone. It's certainly good to be back in Geneva. It's great to be part of this IHL festival. Thank you very much for having me to this occasion. So the organizers have asked me to speak about 3 issues, really, with a focus on asymmetric issues. The reasons of why armed conflict is urbanizing. An overview of the legal issues that arise. How do all the humanitarian concerns that Valerie just pointed out, how do they translate into law? What humanitarian law challenges result from these humanitarian challenges? And then my third point, briefly, is an outlook on what we could possibly do to move ahead. Let me start with the reasons. I think armed conflict is urbanizing much for the same reasons that everything else seems to be urbanizing. Housing prices all over the world are rising in cities because everyone is moving to cities that have a certain pull. I think there are 3 distinct explanatory strands of why armed conflict is urbanizing in particular. The first is that cities are centers of gravity. If you control a city, that carries enormous political weight. Most of us will not know which thrushes of territory so-called Islamic State is controlling, but we all know they have been controlling Mosul and Raqqa. That puts your foot on the map, and it puts a mark on the mind of world opinion. And that can be very important, a strategic overarching goal for why you move to a city, try to control a city. The second explanation of why armed conflict is moving, why military actors are moving into cities, is that cities can often be a source of revenue. You can generate income in cities. So-called Islamic State is said to control everything from oil refineries to bakeries to generate revenue within the city. It's also a breeding ground often for terrorism, so easy recruitment if that is what you're after. The third reason, and that is really the one that links with the logic of asymmetric warfare, is a tactical operational reason. And it's quite obvious actually and much discussed. It's easy to hide in the urban labyrinth. There's sewers, there's tunnels, there's civilian infrastructure. You can mingle with the civilian population. If you're an inferior, militarily inferior party to an armed conflict, this is where you want to go and hide from the other side, which may have better military capabilities. You can hide within that urban infrastructure. It's very difficult, I'll try to speak slowly for the translators. I'm always so happy to speak, so move fast, but I'll try. The other reason is in an urban, densely populated area, it is very difficult to gather intelligence. There is electronic smog and cyber fog, as they call it. It's, for example, if you want to listen to a cell phone communication, that's easy if there's only 5 cell phones within 10 miles. In a city with 500,000 people, it's very, very difficult, often impossible, even for sophisticated military, possibly overwhelming to follow that kind of communication. So the whole situation is confused and unclear. It's difficult to gather intelligence about what's going on within the city. And all of that means for an enemy who wants to go into that city fighting another party, the cost of going into that city is extremely high. Your own soldiers are at high risk for their lives. The civilian population within the city is obviously at dire risk. So, political, economic, and tactical reasons is, I think, why we're seeing urbanization of armed conflict. We're seeing war in cities in various different forms. It occurs in international armed conflict as it occurs in non-international armed conflicts. It can be low-scale, gang type of violence as we probably see in Mogadishu, but it can also be full-fledged war in an urban environment as we've seen in Grozny, in Aden, Yemen, right now, Donetsk, Ukraine, and certainly Aleppo. Now I know when we're talking about wars in cities, Aleppo is the first thing that will come to everyone's mind because it's on the headlines every day, and rightly so, obviously. I want to take a step back from Aleppo maybe, because Aleppo is a unique case, I find, because it doesn't only have all the problems that you have if you have a war within a densely populated area, you also have utter disrespect for even the fundamental rules of IHL. So this is an extremely grave situation, and I want us to be aware that wars in cities raise challenging issues, even if the parties are trying to abide by IHL. Even then, it is very challenging to fight a war in a densely populated area. So, let's move to the legal challenges. What are the legal challenges that we see when a war moves into a city? Now, I could run you through all the principles, distinction, proportionality, precaution, but I want to take a different perspective. I want us to look at the 2 specific characteristica that you find when a war moves into a city that challenge these principles. And the 2 specific characteristica about urban warfare is, I think, unclarity and the fragility of the urban environment. And what I want to do now is just show you how that translates into legal issues. Unclarity is fairly obvious, and I'll be brief on this issue. Unclarity means that the binary code of IHL to distinguish civilians who are protected from the military, the fighters who may be attacked, is obviously extremely difficult if everything gets mingled, if uniforms are discarded, if fighters hide within civilian infrastructure. So the principle of distinction obviously is challenged. Many years ago, the ICRC already looked into that issue. This is why the DPH study that you all know was issued to tackle that problem, and it did, and rightly so. But even with the DPH study, of course, which has clarified the law, implementing it in an urban area is still quite a challenge. And when we're talking about distinction, do not only think about people. In an urban area, it's also about distinguishing objects. Now, you probably all have heard the term dual use, and dual use is not a specific type of object. In essence, the way IHL works, everything can be dual use. If you hide a sniper in a civilian building, it will be turned into a military objective. If you have a civilian apartment but you use it as an ammunition depot, it will be turned into a military objective. So it's often about objects and how we distinguish military objects and civilian protected objects from one another within an urban structure is extremely difficult, and taking into consideration that everything changes very quickly. It may be an ammunition depot on Monday, but no longer on Tuesday. And this in a murky area where getting intelligence, good intelligence, is so difficult. That is the challenge that I mean when I say unclarity is a big problem in these scenarios. And obviously it gets aggravated if one side starts using human shields, if one side deliberately moves its military equipment close to a kindergarten, a hospital, and other protected areas. This is pretty straightforward. I think the more challenging issue legally is the fragility of the urban environment. And much of Valerie's talk was exactly about this issue. Essential urban services, water, electricity, healthcare, waste disposal, you name it, they're often interconnected. You don't have electricity, the water may not be running any longer if you need water purification and so on. They're interconnected and they're very fragile. As Valerie said, you destroy one water pipe, that may look like marginal, negligible damage at first, but the carry-on effects of this can be that thousands of people will be deprived of fresh drinking water. Now, how does that translate into a legal issue? It becomes a legal issue under the principle of proportionality when we have to ask, the party attacking has to ask, well, what kind of civilian damage do I have to take into consideration when I make my proportionality analysis? As you all know, excessive civilian damage must always be avoided. You must not attack if you conclude, well, this attack would lead to excessive civilian damage. Now, the very traditional reading in an open battlefield is you destroy a military structure and you will kill an X number of bystanding civilians. And then you have to do the calculation, well, is destroying the military structure worth, this is cynical, but this is how it works, worth the death of the bystanding civilians? The problem in an urban environment is you hit that water pipe. That is negligible damage, but the carry-on effect is so significant. Do we take into consideration this secondary carry-on effect when we're conducting the proportionality analysis? And my answer is clearly we have to take that into consideration. It would just defy the very purpose of the principle of proportionality if grave civilian impact like this was not to be taken into consideration. Now, of course, we have to be realistic. In a battlefield scenario, we cannot expect the military commander to take into consideration each and every possible side effect of the attack. That is not possible. But everything that's reasonably foreseeable in terms of secondary effects that the attack may have, even if they're delayed, if it's quite reasonable to expect if you destroy the central water pipe that a lot of people will be out of water, especially in a hot and dry area of the world, then you have to take that into consideration. It figures into the proportionality principle, and it may lead to the conclusion that you must not attack. Now, if you look around the world today and the many conflicts we see in cities, I doubt that this is often taken into consideration the way it should be. Something to keep in mind. There is other issues with the proportionality principle. I just brush over them. There is the issue whether mental health within a city, whether mental health is to be taken into consideration as relevant collateral damage. Now, the law uses the term injury, and traditionally we thought of injury as a blown-off arm or other severe injuries, but mental injuries, of course, under a modern reading, should equally be considered as relevant injury for the proportionality principle. Another issue, particularly relevant in urban areas, and Valerie also already alluded to it, is that some weapons that you may absolutely use in an open battlefield, traditional warfighting material, mortars, artillery, rocket launchers, don't raise particular issues in an open battlefield scenario, but they may qualify as indiscriminate weapons if you were to use them in an urban setting. They could be qualified indiscriminate because using artillery and mortar fire in a densely populated area, you just cannot really direct it at just one particular military target. You cannot really control the effects of ammunition that has a wide blast radius. So be aware whether a weapon is indiscriminate or not is context specific. A weapon may be perfectly fine in one scenario, but it may not be in an urban warfare scenario. Thirdly, on legal issues, if there's such a high risk that the civilian population is implicated, and if the area is densely populated, everything you do as the military runs the risk of affecting the civilian population, the issue of precautions becomes extremely important. You know, before you attack, you have to take precautions. You have to verify whether what you want to attack really is military. You have to warn so that the civilian population can take preparatory steps, flee from the impact area, and you have to minimize incidental civilian damage as much as you can. Now, we don't have time to go into all of these different, it's a whole catalog of precautions. We don't have time to look at all, but most of them have a due diligence element. You don't have to take them at all times. You have to take into consideration the circumstances. Again, we're being realistic. It's a battlefield after all. But this due diligence equation, that certainly imposes a stricter standard if from the very beginning you know this is densely populated, civilians running a very high risk of being implicated by what I'm going to do. So the default position here in an urban scenario should certainly be that you have to warn. And you should think twice or thrice if you decide, no, the circumstances are such that I don't have to issue a warning. Okay, with this, I think I'll leave it at legal issues. There are more legal issues. Just a few words on maybe what should be done if we have time. I mixed up my time calculation because I'm speaking so slowly. But if we have time, so what can be done? The mantra, of course, is that we have to strengthen compliance with IHL. I find the current state of the world such that this is not as convincing as it used to be. This is clearly the way forward. This is the mantra of the ICRC, and rightly so. But I'm not sure we've made any progress on strengthening compliance in recent years. And if there's any progress, it's happening at snail's pace. So I don't want to go into that direction, strengthening compliance necessarily. But one thing that we could do and look into, and it's small steps, obviously, in view of things that are happening in Aleppo, but one thing that could be done is closing some glaring gaps within international criminal law. For example, using human shields, which we often see in urban warfare, is not a war crime in non-international armed conflicts. It is a war crime in international armed conflicts. There is no logical reasons why that should not be the same. The same is true for starvation or impeding humanitarian relief. War crime in international armed conflicts, but not in non-international armed conflicts. That is something that could be remedied, in my view, at a low cost. That wouldn't take much. It shouldn't be too difficult to convince everyone that that is a plausible way forward. There are other steps, of course, that could be taken, not necessarily legal. One step could be to strengthen resilience within urban services, to take into consideration when you're constructing a city, designing a city, that in times of war, you need some resilience, fallback options. That's city planning, certainly not a primary legal issue. Also, in terms of technology, autonomous technology will be discussed 1 week from now within the UN. Autonomous, not necessarily autonomous weapons, but other autonomous systems that could move within a densely populated area. They would not run the risk of being killed, and therefore they could operate much more smoothly, much more conservatively, much more cautiously. If you send in an autonomous system that is not at risk for its own life, it could wait before it fires back. Maybe it wouldn't even have to fire back at all. It could gather intelligence slowly, but more accurately than human beings can in a densely populated area. It's just some thoughts of where things could go. Obviously, there are controversial issues about autonomous weapon systems, and I share many of those concerns, but not all is bad about new technology, and this could be one area where it helps. Above all, I think what we need, and this is where I conclude also, is a special care principle. Maybe as a policy principle rather than a legal principle, but we already have in the precaution section that you have an obligation to take constant care about the civilian population. I think in an urban area we have to take special care because every military step is so highly likely to affect the civilian population, and often with secondary and far-reaching effects. I think in terms of policy, we should be looking into a special care principle, and that could filter down and translate into training modules. I mean, the military should train urban warfare and develop a sensitivity of the humanitarian issues that are at stake when you fight war within a city. And one message to the military also should be, I think, often humanitarian logic and military logic will go hand in hand. Too often the two are depicted as somehow contradicting each other. But it is also militarily plausible that you would not waste your ammunition on things that are not military. It is militarily plausible, if you want to win the hearts and minds of a local population, that you abide by IHL, and maybe abide more carefully in terms of policy, abide even more carefully than the law would require you to do, because this is such a fragile environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin. That was really, really important for us to hear about the pool of cities, as you mentioned, the strategic, economic and tactical pool of cities, to hear about the uncertainty and lack of clarity that challenges some of our principles. But I think what was really exciting was to hear some creative and fresh thinking about how we can address this. Just as an aside, recently the ICRC engaged in the very large global discussions called Habitat 3, which is not the traditional place you would find an institution like the ICRC. But we felt it was very important to start engaging in these sort of discussions about safe cities. So I think we need to all think very carefully, and obviously compliance with IHL is very dear to our heart and dear to this room. But I think this idea about looking at what we can do is really important, and I may just come back and cross-examine you a little more. But before I do that, I think it's really important to hear from the other side of the coin, so to speak, those that have a very difficult, unenviable task from a military perspective of trying to apply principles, and from a key security point of view. I'd be really keen to now pass the floor to Eric to give us a discussion, particularly around the obligations of precautions in attack and other site obligations. So Eric, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you to the ICRC for organizing this. I think this is an extremely important topic, and I'm grateful that you are interested enough to be thinking about it as well. I do have to give you one obligatory caveat, unfortunately. I am a professor of law at Brigham Young University, but I have also taken a one-year position as the special counsel to the General Counsel for the Department of Defense of the United States. So I just want to be clear that I am speaking as Professor Eric Jensen, not as Special Counsel Eric Jensen. The views that I give are not the views of the United States, and may in fact be in conflict with some of the official views of the United States. Please don't tell my boss that, and please don't hold me to them. So I would like to first of all endorse what the other two panelists have said. I agree completely with what they've said, not only with the difficulties, but the realities of urban warfare. Having been involved in urban warfare myself, and actually been on the streets, I see all of these difficulties as unfortunately fundamental to how military operations are conducted and the difficulties that they present. I especially appreciated Robin's attempt to give you some ideas to think about moving forward, and I will add to his list just a few. Let me start by saying that my assessment of war in cities is that the current law is sufficient, though we may need to tweak our understanding of the application of the law in some cases, and I will try and highlight that. I am not one who thinks we need to overhaul IHL to deal with this emerging problem of war in cities. I think generally the law is sufficient, and if everyone applied the law, we would find many of these difficulties melt away. So let me maybe give you some examples. I would like to reemphasize some of the things that Valerie said, particularly from the prospect of an attacking military. As you know, most of IHL places obligations on attackers. So let me just reemphasize some of those issues that become so severe, particularly in urban warfare. The idea of essential services, and this is as basic as food. It would be very nice if militaries met in open plains with no civilians there. That would be a very convenient and very sanitary way to conduct war. But that unfortunately is not current war. And basic necessities such as food. If you're out in the countryside, you have a much better opportunity to forage for food and water. In big cities, that often does not exist. The spread of disease obviously takes place at a much higher rate in cities than it does in an open area. The lack of shelter. The access, something as simple as access to the sick and wounded. If someone is laying in a field and is wounded, it's much easier to get to them than if they are buried under a pile of rubble. It's just much more difficult, and almost everything about warfare in cities, from all military perspective, but certainly from an attacker's perspective, become more difficult. Allowing for humanitarian access. First of all, getting them into the city is difficult, and then having them be able to navigate the city. If the city has been rubbled and there are no more clear roads, it's difficult to maneuver in that terrain, it just becomes exponentially more difficult for humanitarians to get in and provide the services that are so vital. And of course, militaries are aware of this. And it's in the military's best interest to have humanitarian access, to have access to food, to not have the spread of disease. The militaries, that does not facilitate military operations, that does not facilitate an end to the conflict. So militaries, compliant militaries, also find these things to be extremely difficult and distracting from the ability to accomplish the military mission. Let me talk to you just for a short minute about weapons and tactics and how those play a role in this as well. In my experience in urban warfare, I was surprised to see the impact of weapons so blatantly in an urban environment. For example, you all know that there is a legal prohibition on expanding ammunition intended to prevent unnecessary suffering. But think about the use of full metal jacket bullets or a tank round in a city. If you have a military objective within a building in a city and you shoot a tank round at it because that's what you would normally do to destroy that type of a target, assume with me for a minute that would be a reasonable decision. That tank round in a city will not necessarily stop in the building that you shoot at, but may travel through successive buildings. I know of one example, again, in my own experience in urban warfare, where a tank round penetrated 9 buildings in a row before it stopped. Hard for a commander to predict that. Hard for a commander to make an educated decision about how that tank round will respond in different urban areas. But it's not just tank rounds, it's a normal bullet. Many walls in urban areas where conflict takes place now do not stop, for example, a bullet. So you might find that people arguing, well, if we used expanding ammunition, that actually might be a humanitarian response to this kind of an environment. Now, I'm not advocating the use of expanding munition, but I'm raising the issue to show that a war in a city presents a difficult issue in many, many ways, and some that will start to push or may push our normal humanitarian thoughts and emphases. Tunneling. Robin mentioned tunneling. There has been some really interesting research recently on tunneling in urban cities. It's a very difficult military problem, and it's tied very closely often with infrastructure, because as someone in a city tries to conduct military operations, they will want to move in tunnels that are not observable by an attacker, but they will often tie those tunnels to infrastructure. And so they will tunnel along the lines of water mains, or they will tunnel along the lines of electrical power. And so the attacker, of course, views that as a tunnel, not as infrastructure, and it becomes a very difficult analysis. Do you pass up attacking that tunnel, knowing that it presents a significant military vulnerability in an effort to preserve the population? In some cases, an attacker can do that. In some cases, a commander may deem that too risky to do that. The intermingling with civilians, Robin has already mentioned this. I think you all are aware of this. It's a very difficult issue. It is very easy for a force to blend into a civilian population, easier in an urban environment than it is out in the open. and that presents very difficult issues with respect to distinction. Let me say a word about warnings. Many people advocate for warnings to warn the civilian population, but there have been any number of situations in recent conflicts in urban cities where after delivering a warning, the group in the city has forced civilians to stay in that area where the warning was given purposely to try and either risk the lives of civilians or to try and immunize those places. And so a commander, when he considers a warning, has to weigh that as an option. If I give a warning, will it actually provide an opportunity for civilians to leave, or will it instead present an opportunity for the fighters to keep civilians there and give them more risk? So these again are some issues where I think our common conception of IHL may have to adjust our thinking slightly with the continuing war in cities. Let me present to you, excuse me, maybe my view of a way where IHL could evolve to help. And that would be increasing the role of the defender in war in cities. The defender knows where the infrastructure is, whereas the attacker may not. The defender knows where the civilian population is, whereas the attacker may not, or may not have good ways to monitor that. The defender knows where, for example, the tunnels are, knows the terrain, much better than the attacker does. Now, we have a provision in IHL, Article 58 of Additional Protocol 1, that places responsibilities on defenders. But as Robin has noted, it's not a war crime. There's no criminal responsibility placed on defenders in these cases. And perhaps we ought to look at that as an option of increasing the protections for civilians in urban areas. And finally, let me again expand maybe a little bit on Robin's call for technology. I believe that technology used both by the attacker and the defender and even by humanitarian organizations could represent a very good way to help protect civilians in these situations. And simple technologies, cheap technologies that you all carry around with you, the ability to set a webcam up, which can be as simple as a laptop, to keep as a way of monitoring traffic, civilian traffic, so that you know where the traffic is. If, for example, this may seem far-fetched to you, but if, for example, the defender was concerned about the population and didn't want the population to be targeted, the defender could post a webcam view of the civilian traffic and post it on the web so that the attacker could go onto that site and look and see where the civilian population was moving and alter their targeting concepts based on the population movement. That's a very simple thing that could happen, very cheap, easy to do and to manage. An additional one might be the use of sensors. Sensors are quite easy you can buy them at a local store where you can sense either through seismic movement or through visual movement, sense the movement of the civilian population, where they are, what they're doing, and then publish that data so that the attacker knows where the civilians are and can alter their operations in accordance with that. Robin mentioned autonomous systems. I know that for many of you there's a gut reaction to the word autonomous. I think that this is an area where autonomous systems could actually be of great benefit. You can go down to a local store and purchase a usable drone with a camera for less than $1,000 that could transmit various areas where if you want all the civilians to go to this area and be safe, you can transmit that data via camera with the drone, and you can make that available to anyone who wants to see it in an effort to get those civilians in areas where attackers will not will not attack that area. And there are lots of other autonomous systems. You can imagine how this would work. So my plea, I guess, would be to think about how we can involve defenders more in this role of protecting civilians in urban warfare. And I would like to end with this caution, which is we ought to be careful that we don't evolve the law of war in response to war in cities in such a way that we incentivize non-compliant fighters to take their fight to the cities. We need to make sure if we're going to evolve the law to provide protections, we don't do so in a way that actually incentivizes the unscrupulous fighter to take his war to the cities.
What I thought I'd do is I actually might ask each of the panellists a question going back to what they explained, pushing them a little bit more on this, and then we'll throw it open to you, because what these conference cycles about is not just about the problem analysis. We hear enough about that in the media. It's really about coming up and engaging with experts on some of the ways forward. So Valerie, I'll ask each of you a question. Valerie, I'd like you to come back a little bit more about what do we need to do with this interesting problem you posed about the interface between development and humanitarian emergencies. I think we often hear, and certainly my engagement with our donors, is it's much more difficult to capture the secondary effects, the many thousands that die, say, of dysentery, as something going forward rather than those who are directly killed in bombardment. So I'd love to hear a few more words from you about how do we change the conversation with donors or with the community of this interface that you find in cities. Robin, I'd really like to push you a little more. It's almost in response to Eric about this idea about increasing the role of defenders, the Article 58 AP1. What are the benefits of doing this, and what are the disadvantages if we look at the law in that way? And I think what was very interesting, Eric, is when you talked about the interface in a war in city between, say, the traditional law enforcement paradigm, where you have the capacity to use bullets, expanding bullets, where you have a different take on some of the legal principles of IHL. Is it more useful? If I pushed you, should war in cities perhaps look more deeply at the law enforcement paradigm rather than the IHL paradigm? Just to push you a bit on that. But Valerie, any reflections on, say, for the humanitarian sector, how we can kickstart the conversation about this interface?
So as I said in my presentation, humanitarian response is very much short-term oriented, at least perceived as being short-term oriented. Relief activities and life-saving assistance are part of humanitarian response, as opposed in bracket, and I will explain why. Development action, which is more long-term oriented, and there has been a thinking that first comes in times of armed conflict, first comes the humanitarian response, and then later on the development response, or the development action, and actually both are not incompatible, and it's important that there is an overlapping between a humanitarian response and a development action. And this is what I tried to explain before. It's very much important not to think in silo and to work together. There is one point in my presentation which maybe raised a few questions, or maybe you are not sure about what I said when I said that it's very important also that humanitarian actors, they work in partnership with local authorities and service providers. This is not something that humanitarian actors usually do, because usually we are on our own, we have our own means to respond to the needs. And usually partnering with authorities is seen as more a development action, or related to development action. And again, it's not impossible that humanitarian actors work in partnership with service providers, and they should even do that if conditions are met. I just give you an example from my experience, because I'm covering Syria now for the ICRC based in Geneva, and I follow very closely the developments in Aleppo. In Aleppo today, there is no way to fix the water networks if you don't partner with the local authorities who know very well, or the water local board. They know very well how the system works, and we could not fix the system on our own. So we need to partner also with the local authorities to do that. And this is why today also water is available in Aleppo, it's thanks to the work we do with the local authorities. So it's very much important not to think in silo, but to work together, as I said, in a complementary way.
Yeah, the question was the role of the defender. I do agree with Eric that more attention should be paid to the role of the defender, the precautions the defending side has to take to protect its own civilian population. This is Article 58 in the first additional protocol. It's also customary, and it has been under-researched and not gotten much attention in the past. The focus is usually on Article 57, the precautions the attacking side has to take. So, two sides to the same coin. We want to protect the civilian population at the end of the day. So certainly we should look more into these Article 58 precautions of the defender, but we should also be clear that whatever the defending side does, even if it doesn't abide by any of those obligations, even if it turns to human shielding, that doesn't lower any of the obligations of the attacking side. And I think we're in full agreement on this, but I think it's important when we say this. So we're not shifting the onus to 58 in the defender. Both sides are equally important. Both sides have to abide by IHL. If either side doesn't, that doesn't change anything for the other side. There is no downward spiral reciprocity here. That's very, especially in asymmetric and urban constellations, very important. Just one more reflection on criminalizing failure to abide by these obligations. The defending side not taking the precautions it is obliged to take under Article 58 is currently not criminalized. I would be very fond of criminalizing failure to implement these precautions, as I'm fond of implementing criminal provisions for failing to implement Article 57 precautions. The problem is that this is slightly at odds with the war crimes regime we've seen so far. The war crimes we know, they are usually for deliberate acts. A soldier deliberately kills a civilian, that is a war crime. Now, failure to take precautions has to do with omission, has often to do with some element of negligence. And turning negligent behavior into war crimes is something, I regret to say this, I think states are not ready to do at this stage. That would close enormous loopholes in the criminal law area, and I'm, as I said, very fond of this, but I just don't think that is realistic at this stage, especially with the dynamic we're seeing at the ICC, generally states withdrawing and so on. This is probably not the moment to be that progressive, although I really like the idea.
I absolutely agree with Robin, and I should have emphasized the Article 57 point, because I do not want you to think I'm advocating for any lessening of that. I'm really advocating for a balance between the two, a lifting of both responsibilities, both 57 and 58 responsibilities. As to the law enforcement paradigm that you asked me specifically about, this again is one of the problems in an urban environment, because the civilians who are just trying to survive, military should treat them in a very humanitarian way, often in compliance with the law enforcement environment, where you would use force as a last resort and only to defend against serious criminal activity that would result in death or serious injury to someone else, those kinds of things. The difficulty, of course, comes back to the principle of distinction. How, when you're moving through an environment such as Mosul, how do you know who are the fighters and who are the civilians? How do you? It's very difficult to tell that. And as smart as soldiers are around the world, it's a lot to ask them to be able to transition in a split second from one kind of environment to another in a situation where life and death is at play. Now, I think we have to expect that of them. We have to expect soldiers to be able to make those distinctions and to be able to do that as often as possible. But I think we also have to recognize that there are going to be situations where that differentiation is going to be very difficult to make on the ground, given the facts at the time. But I agree with you that that certainly would be an appropriate type of paradigm to apply to the civilians in these areas, if it can be done.
Great, well thank you. I won't be selfish and spend the night asking you questions. I will throw it to the audience.
Yo tengo dos preguntas en realidad, usando un poco la confianza. La primera tiene que ver un poco con el tema de proporcionalidad. Una característica de los conflictos armados es este término de niebla de guerra, quizás más actual en los conflictos armados contemporáneos, donde es imposible para el entendimiento humano quizás analizar todas las circunstancias y todo lo que pasa en una situación de conflicto, máxime si este se desarrolla justamente en un entorno urbano. Y en ese sentido mi pregunta es si quizás la definición de proporcionalidad establecida en el protocolo adicional primero no ha sido de alguna manera complementada cómo entiende el Estatuto de Roma la proporcionalidad al añadir como factor de responsabilidad penal por crímenes de guerra que sea manifiesta la desproporción entre la ventaja militar concreta y directa y el daño incidental, sumándole además de que tiene que ser el ataque en su conjunto y no incidente por incidente, es decir, no a nivel necesariamente táctico, sino a nivel operacional. Mi pregunta es, ¿no el Estatuto de Roma sube un poco el estándar de proporcionalidad del Protocolo Adicional 1 y no deberíamos entenderlo, atendiendo además a la naturaleza tan compleja de los conflictos armados modernos, bajo esta lógica de solo exigir responsabilidad cuando sea manifiesta la desproporcionalidad entre la ventaja militar concreta y directa y el daño incidental? Primera pregunta. Y la segunda es un poco con lo que mencionaba el segundo expositor al final de su exposición con el tema de legitimidad. Ganarse los corazones y las mentes. Sé que no es un tema necesariamente humanitario, pero uno de los temas que a mí personalmente me preocupan y creo que se tiene que tener intereses. ¿Cómo haces que el personal militar cumpla DIH? Porque está obligado a hacerlo. ¿No deberíamos poner mayor hincapié en decirle, tienes que cumplir las normas de derecho internacional humanitario porque finalmente su cumplimiento te puede ayudar a ganar ese máximo objetivo estratégico que es finalmente acabar con el conflicto? No deberíamos, y quizás un poco la invasión a Irak del 2003 y cómo esto finalmente se desarrolló es un buen ejemplo de ello, ¿no? En 3 semanas toman Bagdad, pero no logran ganar los corazones y mentes, y eso de alguna manera significó que no se cumpliese el objetivo. Es cuando cambian, digamos, el paradigma donde finalmente las Fuerzas Armadas estadounidenses y británicas pues pueden cumplir sus objetivos estratégicos. Y yo justamente hago incidencia en este tema, legitimidad, ganarse a la población. No es algo que deberíamos incidir en el tema de la enseñanza también del DIH. ¿Por qué respetar DIH es justamente importante en ese contexto? Muchas gracias. Va dirigido quizás sobre todo al segundo expositor, si me permite.
شكرا للساده المتحدثين على تلك العروض المتميزه. وسؤال الدكتور روبن بعد اذنك، كنت تناولت سيادتك خلال عرضك لموضوع تعزيز المرونه بالنسبه للخدمات وتخطيط المدن والتكنولوجيا التقنيه التي سوف تناقش في الامم المتحده الاسبوع القادم. ما هو المقصود تحديدا بالنقطه الاخيره؟ استخدام التكنولوجيا التقنيه وارسال نظام تلقائي لجمع المعلومات. بس عايز توضيح ليها بعد اذن حضرتك. شكرا.
Je vous remercie. Je suis professeur Larba Yarga, Université Ouaga 2, membre du conseil de direction de la Croix-Rouge Burkina Faso, et je représente le groupe africain des conseils juridiques des sociétés nationales. J'ai écouté les 3 intervenants que je félicite pour leurs prestations. Et la question que je fais une première observation adressée à tous les 3. Parce que les questions de conflit, de violence, de guerre en milieu urbain. D'un point de vue didactique, je m'attendais à ce que pour chacun de ces termes, conflit, violence, guerre, on nous situe pour que nous sachions quel est en fait le degré à partir duquel on passe de l'un à l'autre et ensuite au niveau de la guerre. Et ça, c'est d'un point de vue didactique. Maintenant, je me dis que par rapport à la guerre en milieu urbain, c'est vrai que nous sommes dans une situation où il y a emploi d'armes. Mais il y a d'armes à feu précisément, mais nous assistons de plus en plus dans les milieux urbains, lors des manifestations, à l'utilisation de plusieurs types d'armes, de projectiles à l'endroit des forces de l'ordre par exemple, et cela amène certaines forces de l'ordre en fait à utiliser des balles réelles. Et parfois, il y a des courses-poursuites qui font que les manifestants entrent dans des cours et du coup, on mélange tout le monde dans les différentes dans les représailles. Donc c'est un aspect également qui est quand même assez préoccupant. Deuxièmement, je me dis que quand on parle justement du principe de proportionnalité, c'est bon, mais le harcèlement des snipers n'est-il pas de nature à faire échec à l'observation des principes de proportionnalité? Parce que celui qui est sur le terrain est dans le feu de l'action, et étant dans le feu de l'action, eh bien, il s'attend à tout moment à prendre une balle. Alors, si pour dire, il y a en théorie, il y a un DIH, le principe de proportionnalité, je vais, disons, freiner mon action et faire attention à ceci, cela, il va tomber sur le terrain, ben, je crois que ça, il met, je crois, ces principes-là au second plan pour d'abord raisonner en termes de survie. Qu'en pensez-vous?
Now, thank you very much. I'll let the panel answer those three, and I do see there will be a few more questions, so I'll just throw the three that we have to the panel. Robin, I think you were asked about the clouds of war, or the ICC, and issues about legitimacy. And so perhaps you'd like to start with that, and then we'll move on to technology and autonomous weapons.
Sure, will do. I think the first question from the Spanish-speaking speaker, whose name I didn't catch, I'm afraid, was about the fog of war, and the fog of war indeed is particularly thick when we're talking about an urban environment where everything is so unclear. That is not necessarily automatically a proportionality issue. It is in the sense that it may be difficult to assess the secondary effects that your attack could have, but often it's more about the precautions I was talking about, the precautionary measure that you have to verify whether something is really military or not. That is the principle that is challenged here, and I think that's where we have to talk about what kind of accuracy of information do we require. Is it, do you have to be certain that something is military, or is remaining doubt okay? Often there will be some level of doubt. How far can we go? How much accuracy, how much certainty do we demand? How much does the law actually require? What is realistic, what is not? That is one of the gray zones certainly that would benefit from some further clarification. And just in terms of technology, what I meant when I referred to autonomous systems, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get good intelligence in an urban setting is that you will probably not want to send your own soldiers in to find out. It's just a high-risk environment, so human intelligence is hard to come by. An autonomous system, and one that could be very small, the size of a fly, that you could send in. There would be no risk to your soldier's life. That system could monitor the situation better and could help you to attack much more accurately and to better protect the civilian population. That was my take in terms of technology.
Thank you. And Eric, would you like to comment on the autonomous weapons and maybe about the proportionality and even the legitimacy point?
Yeah, I'd love to take time to comment on all of those, but I will not answer every question. I will, let me start with the technology question, and I agree with Robin again. But you don't have to have the capability to produce an autonomous weapon the size of a fly to take advantage of some of these systems. Again, if you have a power source and a computer, you can hook it to the internet and take a streaming picture of an intersection that will show exactly who is moving through that intersection all the time. Publish it on the web, and the attacker now has access to that and knows where the civilian population is. That seems to me, as if I'm an attacker, that would be very valuable to me and assist me in knowing how and when I can attack or should I attack, because I would know where the civilian population was. Very simple system. There are also very cheap sensors you can buy that are seismic. These are very cheap. You can buy them, and it just shows, it doesn't identify who's in the area, but it identifies that there is movement and seismic percussion in the area. So that if you publish that again to an attacker would know there's movement in this area. I know that there are people there, so if I'm going to attack an object, I need to determine whether those people are civilians or military. Very simple, very cheap. You can buy them at most technology stores. Another one would be the drone. Less cheap, maybe 1,000 francs or dollars or euros, whatever you're spending, but a drone that will operate with a fairly good range, that will send a video stream back. These are cheaper than many weapon systems that even simple fighters organizations purchase and use, and they would be a great application of technology. Let me very quickly deal with the police and law enforcement actions and the sniper issue that you raised, sir. So let me be clear about my response to militaries applying law enforcement paradigm. I think that we do not generally train militaries to do that, so we don't do that well. And even in cities, I'm not sure how well we do that, but we should be able to do that better. And if it really is a law enforcement paradigm, maybe the military is not the best instrument to use in that situation. I will say, with respect to the sniper and the proportionality issue, I agree that a sniper is not a proportionality issue generally, unless you think the bullet may travel through the target and kill someone else. But it's, for me, mostly a distinction issue. Does that sniper know that that individual is the target and is a legitimate target? And if so, then I think the proportionality issue is not, it's really the distinction issue that is considered there.
It's really interesting, Valerie, you talk about working with local capacities or local authorities. In fact, in the Code of Conduct, number 6, it says you should be working with local capacities. Yet we see so systematically this thing is not happening. So it's maybe change of mindsets in the way humanitarians are working, that it shouldn't be an exception, but a rule that they should be working. And I think the World Humanitarian Conference that took place in May really emphasized these things about localization and local capacity. And the second thing is this thing about humanitarian and development actors working together. Often actually it's the humanitarians who hold up the principles as a barrier to working with development actors. So it's also us humanitarians who need to change our mindsets to make sure that we work in collaboration with development, because it's absolutely essential. Thank you.
نعم، سؤال محدد ومختصر. تحدثتم عن واجبات المهاجم وواجبات المدافع. أعتقد أنكم تقصدون في هذه الحالات بحسب المواد التي ذكرت النزاعات المسلحة الدولية من مادة 57 و 58 من البروتوكول الإضافي الأول. سؤالي أن ما يحدث اليوم في عالمنا هو في أغلب الحالات نشهد نزاعات مسلحة غير دولية مرعية بالمادة الثالثة من اتفاقيات جنيف والبروتوكول الإضافي الثاني. ونحن نعلم أن البروتوكول الإضافي الثاني لم يأتي على ذكر حظر الهجمات العشوائية وحظر الهجمات الانتقامية، ولم لم يأتي على ذكر واجب اتخاذ التدابير الاحتياطية أثناء الهجوم وأثناء صد الهجوم. وأيضا في المادة 18 منه أوجب الحصول على موافقة الطرف الآخر لتقديم أعمال الغوث الإنسانية. برأيكم في ظل هكذا نصوص قانونية ترعى النزاعات المسلحة غير الدولية، هل يمكن الوصول إلى تأمين حماية صحيحة للمدنيين أثناء الحروب التي تحصل في المدن في تلك البلدان؟ وشكرا.
Shukran. Valerie, would you like to just make maybe a last one sentence or comment on the comment that was expressed there? I'll then ask the other two speakers either side to say a 1-minute response to the questions and wrap up. Valerie.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I fully agree. We are on the same line, and it's even more important to work with local actors since they have the knowledge, the capacity, the expertise, and the access also very much. They are very much present in the field as opposed to humanitarian actors, international ones sometimes, which cannot access some areas. Just one point maybe regarding the cooperation between humanitarian actors and development actors. We have to keep in mind that in armed conflicts sometimes partnering with the local authorities may be perceived as going against the humanitarian principles, mainly the one of neutrality. And this is something that as humanitarian actors we have to take into account also, that we have to stick to principles. So in some contexts, partnerships with local authorities are simply not possible if we want to stick to principles, but in theory, I fully agree, we should work in that direction together in a complementary way. Thank you.
Yeah, regarding your question, absolutely, you're right. There is glaring gaps in treaty law when it comes to differences between international and non-international armed conflict, but many of those gaps have been remedied by virtue of customary international law. Now, there is still some disagreement on some of those areas, but you mentioned indiscriminate attacks. For example, I think there is no doubt that this is prohibited in both types of armed conflict. This is customary law, and I think that's undisputed.
Yeah, I will just echo what Robin said. I will plug the ICRC Customary International Humanitarian Law Study, which I'm sure you all have on your desks in your offices. But that gives a great analysis of which of those provisions apply in non-international armed conflicts as well. But I think your point that this could expand and we could expect more in a non-international armed conflict, because that's most of the kinds of armed conflicts we see today, is valid. Of course, that's driven by states. States make international law, so we all need to work together to make that happen with our states that we represent.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think I must apologise for not being able to answer all the questions. We will certainly have, hopefully, the chance with some of the speakers straight afterwards. But I think the finishing point that we must all work together is a really important point to finish this, I think, what has been a really interesting and I think exciting start to our conference cycle. May I encourage you to access copies of the International Review, to look at our law and policy blog. Please engage with this work. We need all of your ideas, all of your tenacity and all of your creativity to deal with this issue. But please join me in thanking the speakers, and I wish you a good evening. Thank you.